The breaking point. Admiral Sarah Kensington had spent 30 years building bridges between species that had spent centuries trying to destroy each other. She stood in the central chamber of the Galactic Peace Coalition, a massive structure that floated in neutral space between 12 different star systems. Through the transparent dome above, she could see the swirling colors of the nebula sector, a constant reminder that the universe was vast and beautiful when species chose cooperation over conflict. The chamber held representatives from 47 different civilizations. Some breathed methane, others required intense cold, and a few existed partially in dimensions that most species could not perceive. But they all gathered here because of one shared belief, that intelligent life was too precious to waste on endless war. Sarah had been instrumental in fostering that belief. She had shared humanity's own brutal history, the wars that had nearly destroyed Earth, the weapons that could have ended all life on the planet, and most importantly, the hard-won lessons that came after. She had shown them that civilization was not about the absence of capacity for violence, but about the choice to pursue better paths. The human delegation was small but respected. Earth had joined the Galactic Peace Coalition 3 decades ago, bringing with them advanced medical technology, agricultural techniques, and most valuably, a philosophical framework for conflict resolution. Humans were known throughout the galaxy as patient negotiators, creative problem solvers, and tireless advocates for peaceful coexistence. When two species seemed ready to go to war, they often asked for human mediators. When ancient grudges threatened to explode into violence, human diplomats would spend years finding common ground. Sarah herself had negotiated 17 major peace treaties. She had prevented 4 wars that could have killed billions. She had received honors from species whose names humans could barely pronounce. She took pride in this work, not because she sought recognition, but because she genuinely believed that every sentient being deserved a chance to live without fear of annihilation. Her office aboard the human diplomatic vessel contained artifacts from grateful civilizations, each one representing lives saved and futures preserved. On this particular morning, Sarah was reviewing proposals for a new cultural exchange program between the water-dwelling Aquarians and the silicon-based Lithons. It was delicate work, finding ways for species with completely different biological needs to understand each other, but it was work she loved. She was so absorbed in the details that she almost did not notice when her communications officer rushed into the room. Lieutenant Chen was normally composed and professional, but now his face was pale and his hands were shaking. "Admiral, we have lost contact with Haven's Rest," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "All communication ceased 40 minutes ago. We have been trying every channel and getting nothing but silence." Haven's Rest was a human colony world located near the border of Zithran collective space. It was a beautiful planet of rolling grasslands and clear blue oceans, home to 4.7 million human colonists. The colony had been established 22 years ago as part of humanity's expansion into the outer sectors. It was known for its agricultural output, its universities, and its artists. Haven's Rest exported food to 6 neighboring systems and had become a symbol of humanity's peaceful integration into galactic society. Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she kept her voice calm. "Have we confirmed this with the orbital stations? Sometimes solar interference can disrupt surface communications." Even as she said it, she knew it was unlikely. Haven's Rest had redundant communication systems specifically designed to prevent such blackouts. Chen shook his head. "Admiral, the orbital stations are also silent. We sent an automated probe through the system 40 minutes ago as part of routine monitoring. The probe detected no active transponders anywhere in the Haven's Rest system. No stations, no satellites, no ships, nothing." He paused, struggling with what to say next. "Admiral, there is debris. A lot of debris. The probe sensors indicate massive orbital installations have been destroyed." Sarah was already moving toward the bridge before Chen finished speaking. Around her, the diplomatic vessel transformed from a place of quiet scholarship into a military command center. Officers rushed to their stations and screens filled with data streaming in from the probe. What Sarah saw made her blood turn to ice. Haven's Rest was gone. Not conquered, not occupied, but systematically dismantled. The orbital defense platforms had been reduced to floating scrap metal. The space elevators that connected the surface to orbit had been cut down, their massive structures collapsed across the landscape like fallen giants. The agricultural satellites that monitored crops and weather were shattered. Every piece of human technology in orbit had been methodically destroyed. But that was not the worst of it. As more data came in, the sensors revealed what had happened on the surface. Cities were intact structurally, but completely empty. The probe's thermal imaging showed no signs of life, no heat signatures of humans going about their daily lives. Farms stood abandoned with crops rotting in the fields. Schools were empty with children's belongings still at their desks. It was as if 4.7 million people had simply vanished. Then the probe found the processing centers. Massive industrial facilities that had not been there 3 weeks ago during the last survey. Facilities with conveyor systems and storage units and transport ships docked at loading bays. The probe's analysis identified biological material residue throughout these facilities. Human biological material. Sarah stared at the data for a long moment, her mind refusing to accept what she was seeing. Then the full horror crashed over her like a wave. The Zithran had not attacked Haven's Rest as an act of war. They had harvested it. 4.7 million human beings had been processed as resources, as raw materials, as things rather than people. "Get me the Galactic Peace Coalition immediately," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emergency session, all members, no exceptions. And send a message to Earth Command. Tell them to implement Protocol Ragnarok standby status." Lieutenant Chen looked at her with wide eyes. Protocol Ragnarok was something most humans hoped would never be activated. It was a sealed military doctrine from Earth's pre-coalition days, a set of strategic plans that had been locked away when humanity chose to become peacemakers instead of warriors. Chen had never seen the details, but everyone knew that Protocol Ragnarok represented everything humanity had decided not to be. "Admiral, are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Send the message," Sarah said. "And pray that I am wrong about what we are going to find." The emergency session of the Galactic Peace Coalition convened 6 hours later. The Great Chamber was filled with agitated representatives from dozens of species. News of Haven's Rest had spread quickly, and everyone wanted answers. Sarah stood at the central podium, her face composed but her eyes holding something that made even the most aggressive species uncomfortable. Behind her, massive screens displayed the probe data in terrible detail. The Zithran collective representative was already present, a tall insectoid being with a crystalline exoskeleton that refracted light into rainbow patterns. Delegate Zack stood motionless as the evidence was presented, showing no reaction to the images of destroyed human settlements and industrial processing facilities. When the presentation ended, the chamber erupted in shocked conversation. Species who had fought wars against each other for centuries looked at the data with disgust. Even predator species who hunted for survival were disturbed by what they saw. This was not warfare, not survival, not any principle that civilized beings could recognize. The coalition speaker, an elderly being from a species that lived for 3 centuries, called for order. "Delegate Zax, the Galactic Peace Coalition demands an explanation. The human colony of Haven's Rest has been destroyed, and the evidence suggests systematic processing of the civilian population. This is a violation of every principle this coalition was founded upon." Zax finally moved, its limbs clicking together in a gesture that translators interpreted as casual dismissal. The Zithran collective acknowledges the removal of the human presence from the Haven's Rest system. This action was taken in accordance with Zithran law and custom. The system falls within traditional Zithran territorial claims that predate human arrival by 6 centuries. Sarah felt something cold settle into her chest. "Territorial claims do not justify genocide," she said quietly. "Genocide implies the destruction of a species," Zax replied, its voice carrying no emotion that human ears could detect. "The Zithran collective has not destroyed humanity. We have simply processed resources found within our territory. The humans who settled on Haven's Rest were utilizing biological materials that rightfully belong to the collective. We have reclaimed those materials for proper use." The chamber fell silent. For a moment, no one seemed able to process what they had just heard. Then several delegates began speaking at once, their voices rising in outrage. But Sarah did not join them. She stood perfectly still, staring at Zax with an expression that made the Zithran delegate shift uncomfortably. "You processed them," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the noise. The chamber quieted. 4.7 million human beings. Children, artists, farmers, teachers, families. You processed them like raw materials. "We processed biological resources that were improperly utilized," Zax corrected. The Zithran collective does not recognize the human claim that individual biological units possess inherent value. This is a cultural difference, nothing more. We expect the coalition to respect our cultural practices as we have respected yours." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering this argument. Then she touched a control on the podium. The screens behind her changed, displaying new images. These were from Earth's history, from humanity's own darkest chapters. Concentration camps, ethnic cleansing, industrialized murder on scales that made several species physically ill to witness. "These are images from Earth's past," Sarah said quietly. "Times when humans did to other humans exactly what you have done to our people at Haven's Rest. Times when we decided that some groups of humans were not people, but resources to be exploited or eliminated. We call these periods our greatest shame. We teach our children about them so they will never be repeated. We built an entire philosophical framework to ensure that we would never again reduce sentient beings to materials for processing. She turned to face Zax directly. For 30 years, I have worked to share that framework with this galaxy. I have believed that every species was capable of learning what humanity learned through centuries of blood and suffering. I have advocated for patience, for understanding, for giving every civilization time to develop ethical systems that value individual life. The screens changed again, now showing the sealed military files that Earth had kept hidden for 3 decades. Weapon systems, strategic doctrines, tactical approaches that made the more militaristic species in the chamber lean forward with sudden interest. But I was wrong about something fundamental, Sarah continued. I believed that humanity's choice to be peaceful made us different from our violent past. I thought we had evolved beyond what we once were. She paused. We have not evolved beyond anything. We have simply been choosing differently. And the Zithran Collective has just made a choice that removes our choice to be civilized with them. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many delegates as possible. I am formally announcing that humanity is withdrawing from all peace treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic protocols with the Zithran Collective. Effective immediately, humanity considers itself in a state of total war with the Zithran species. Total war? The coalition speaker looked confused. Admiral Kensington, surely you mean conventional military conflict within established parameters? No, Sarah said, and her voice carried a weight that made several species step back from their positions. Total war. The kind humanity fought against itself before we learned better. The kind where there are no protected targets, no civilian safe zones, no limits on acceptable weapons or tactics. The kind where the only goal is the complete destruction of the enemy's ability and will to continue existing as an organized civilization. She turned back to Zax. You said that you do not recognize individual humans as having inherent value. That we are simply biological resources to be processed. I accept your position. And I inform you that humanity will now treat the Zithran Collective with the same philosophy. You are not people to us anymore. You are a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimum regard for your continued existence. Zax's crystalline body seemed to darken slightly. You threaten the collective? You are one species. We span 14 systems with populations numbering in the hundreds of billions. Your threats are meaningless. Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I am not threatening you, Delegate Zax. Threats imply a choice, an opportunity to change course and avoid consequences. I am informing you of what is going to happen. Humanity is going to dismantle the Zithran Collective piece by piece until nothing remains but a warning to other species about what happens when you process human children into biological resources. She gathered her materials and prepared to leave the chamber. All non-Zithran vessels have 72 hours to evacuate from collective space. After that, humanity will not be responsible for what happens to anyone who remains in the conflict zone. And to the rest of the coalition, I apologize. You are about to see what humanity looks like when we stop choosing to be civilized. I recommend you take notes, because this is a lesson you do not want to learn by making the same mistake the Zithran just made. Sarah walked out of the chamber, leaving behind a silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Behind her, Delegate Zax stood frozen, its crystalline body refracting light that suddenly seemed much colder than before. The galaxy had just been given a warning, and deep in command centers across human space, Protocol Ragnarok began to activate for the first time in 30 years. The age of human peacemaking was over. The age of human reckoning had begun. The reckoning. The first Zithran world went dark 73 hours after Admiral Kensington's declaration. Not destroyed, not invaded, simply dark. Every communication satellite stopped broadcasting. Every power grid failed simultaneously. Every computer system crashed and refused to reboot. 3 billion Zithran on the industrial world of KRYX Prime found themselves suddenly isolated, their technology rendered useless by something they could not see or understand. The Zithran Collective's military command initially dismissed it as a technical malfunction. They sent repair ships and technical teams to investigate. Those ships reported finding nothing wrong with the equipment itself. The satellites were intact, the power plants were functional, and the computer cores showed no physical damage. Everything should have worked perfectly, but nothing did. It was as if the technology had simply forgotten how to be technology. By the time the Zithran understood what had happened, 4 more worlds had gone dark. Humanity had deployed something the galaxy had never seen before, cascading AI viruses designed specifically to target Zithran neural network technology. The Zithran had built their entire civilization on interconnected systems that mimicked their own hive-minded biological structure. Humanity had studied those systems for 30 years while pretending to be interested only in cultural exchange. Now they used that knowledge to inject digital poison into the very foundation of Zithran society. The viruses were elegant and terrifying. They did not destroy, they corrupted. They made Zithran computers believe that up was down, that power flowing was power stopped, that communication signals were just meaningless noise. The technology remained physically intact, but it became as useful as a brain that had forgotten how to tell the heart to beat. Within 2 weeks, 17 Zithran worlds were functionally isolated from each other and their own planetary infrastructure. But the digital assault was only the beginning. While Zithran leadership scrambled to understand the technological plague spreading through their systems, human fleets moved into position. These were not the exploration vessels or diplomatic ships the galaxy had known for 3 decades. These were warships that had been built in secret facilities hidden in the outer reaches of human space, constructed during the years when humanity publicly advocated for peace while quietly preparing for the possibility that peace would fail. The vessels were smaller than traditional battleships, designed around principles that most galactic militaries had not considered. They did not carry massive energy weapons meant to punch through heavy armor. They did not need to. Instead, they carried deployment systems for weapons that worked on entirely different principles. Nanoscale machines that could be seeded into planetary atmospheres. Biological agents tailored to specific physiological weaknesses. Psychological warfare tools based on 3 decades of studying how different species processed fear and trauma. Observer ships from neutral species watched the human campaign unfold with growing horror. The Arxian Confederacy, a militaristic empire that had fought wars for 2,000 years, sent their most experienced military analysts to document what humanity was doing. General Thax had witnessed conflicts across hundreds of worlds. He had seen orbital bombardments, planetary invasions, and wars of attrition that lasted for generations. He thought he understood what warfare looked like. He was wrong. Humanity was not fighting a war in any traditional sense. They were conducting a systematic dismantling of an entire civilization using methods that were invisible, inescapable, and utterly ruthless. Thax recorded everything with the detached professionalism of a career soldier, but his private logs revealed a man watching something that kept him awake at night. Day 19 of the human campaign, Thax dictated into his personal recorder, his voice strained with exhaustion. The humans have neutralized 32 Zithran worlds without firing a single energy weapon. They do not conquer territory. They do not seek surrender. They simply break things in ways that cannot be fixed and then move on to the next target. He pulled up tactical displays showing human fleet movements. The patterns made no sense according to conventional military doctrine. Human ships appeared to ignore strategic targets like military bases or resource centers. Instead, they focused on seemingly random locations, civilian data hubs, agricultural distribution centers, educational facilities, cultural archives. It took Thax 3 days to recognize the pattern. Humanity was not trying to defeat the Zithran military. They were trying to erase Zithran civilization itself. On Zithran worlds that still had functioning communications, reports began filtering out about something even more disturbing. Zithran civilians were beginning to experience psychological breakdowns on a massive scale. Entire cities reported epidemic levels of anxiety, paranoia, and despair. The collective's mental health facilities were overwhelmed within days. Medical teams found no physical cause for the symptoms, no biological agents or chemical contaminants that could explain the sudden collapse of mental stability across billions of individuals. Humanity had deployed atmospheric processors that released compounds carefully designed to interact with Zithran neurochemistry. The compounds were not toxic, they did not damage tissue or disrupt biological functions. They simply altered how Zithran brains processed threat assessment and social cohesion. Species that had evolved as hive-minded collectives relied on constant subconscious communication through pheromones and bioelectric signals. The human compounds disrupted that communication just enough to make every Zithran feel fundamentally isolated and vulnerable. Imagine suddenly being unable to feel the presence of your own species, one human xenobiologist explained to General Thax during a brief interview. Imagine being a human who could no longer recognize other humans as part of your social group. That primal sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in a hostile universe. That is what we have given the Zithran. Not death, but the constant feeling that death is coming and they will face it alone. The Zithran collective's military finally mounted an organized response on day 27. They gathered a massive fleet of nearly 8,000 warships, the largest military force the collective had ever assembled. The fleet was placed under the command of Supreme Coordinator Vrath, a military leader who had conquered 6 species and expanded Zithran territory across 14 systems. Vrath was confident that overwhelming force would crush the human fleets and restore collective dominance. The fleet moved toward the human positions in a traditional battle formation, expecting to engage in ship-to-ship combat where Zithran numerical superiority would prove decisive. Instead, human vessels simply retreated, refusing to engage in direct confrontation. The Zithran fleet pursued, growing more confident with each day that the humans fled before them. Vrath declared victory and began planning the invasion of human colony worlds in retaliation for the attacks on collective territory. While the Zithran fleet chased shadows in deep space, small human ships had been moving through undefended collective territory. They carried a different kind of weapon, one that would not show its effects for months or years. Genetic modification agents specifically designed to target Zithran reproductive biology. The agents were released into water supplies, agricultural systems, and atmospheric processors on every major Zithran world. The modifications were subtle and insidious. They did not kill adult Zithran or cause immediate illness. Instead, they altered the genetic code of reproductive cells, introducing errors that would accumulate across generations. Zithran eggs would fail to develop properly. Hatchlings would be born with systemic failures that made survival impossible. Fertility rates would plummet across the entire species. Within 3 generations, the Zithran collective would face biological extinction, not from direct attack but from their own compromised genome. By the time Vrath realized that the human fleet had been deliberately drawing his forces away from defended worlds, it was too late. The genetic modifications had already spread through 70% of the collective's population. Human ships that had seemed to flee in cowardice had actually been executing a strategy that guaranteed Zithran extinction regardless of any military victory they might achieve. On day 41, Zithran medical researchers confirmed what humanity had done. The reports spread through collective leadership like poison. Every Zithran alive was now potentially carrying genetic damage that would manifest in their offspring. Even if they somehow defeated humanity militarily, even if they reclaimed every world and rebuilt every system, the Zithran species had been given a death sentence that would execute itself slowly over the coming decades. The Zithran Queen, an ancient being who had ruled the collective for 3 centuries, finally understood the magnitude of the mistake her species had made. She had authorized the harvesting of Haven's Rest based on traditional Zithran philosophy that non-collective life had no inherent value. It had seemed like a simple resource acquisition operation, no different from mining minerals or collecting energy. The human response had seemed irrational at first, an emotional overreaction from a species that claimed to value peace. Now the Queen understood that she had made the same error that countless species throughout history had made. She had mistaken human kindness for weakness, had interpreted their advocacy for peace as inability to wage war. The humans had not been unable to fight like this for the past 30 years. They had been choosing not to. And the Zithran had made them stop choosing peace. The Queen authorized a formal communication to Admiral Kensington. It was the first time in recorded Zithran history that the collective had requested negotiation from a position of weakness. The message was transmitted on all frequencies, broadcast across every communication network that still functioned in collective space. Admiral Kensington received the message aboard the human flagship Determination. She read it carefully, then read it again, making sure she understood exactly what was being offered. The Queen was proposing immediate cessation of hostilities, full reparations for Haven's Rest, and acknowledgement of human sovereignty over disputed territories. It was more than most species had ever extracted from the Zithran, an offer that represented complete capitulation. Sarah sat alone in her quarters for a long time, staring at the message. Around her, the ship hummed with the activity of thousands of personnel maintaining humanity's war machine. She thought about the 4.7 million people who had died at Haven's Rest. She thought about the children whose last moments had been spent in terror as they were processed like industrial resources. She thought about the families who would never know what happened to their loved ones because there was nothing left to bury or mourn. Then she thought about what humanity had become in response. The genetic weapons that would doom billions of Zithran who had nothing to do with Haven's Rest. The psychological warfare that left entire populations traumatized and broken. The cold calculation that had turned human diplomats and peacemakers into architects of species-wide extinction. Sarah composed her response carefully, knowing that it would define how the galaxy viewed humanity for generations to come. The message was brief and absolute. To the Zithran Queen and collective leadership, humanity acknowledges receipt of your proposal for negotiation. We decline. Your offer comes too late and offers too little. You will surrender unconditionally within 48 hours or we will continue the systematic dismantling of your civilization until nothing remains but a warning to others. You will reduce your territory to 3 worlds of our choosing. You will dismantle all military capabilities beyond basic system defense. You will submit to monitoring and genetic treatment to reverse the modifications we have introduced. This monitoring will continue for 3 centuries. Every generation of Zithran will be born knowing that your species exists only because humanity chose to stop. Not because you earned mercy, but because we decided that total extinction was not who we want to be. You have 48 hours to accept these terms. After that, we will assume you prefer extinction to accountability. Choose wisely. You will not receive another opportunity. The message was transmitted across all frequencies, broadcast not just to the Zithran but to every species in the galaxy. Within hours, the Zithran Queen accepted every term without modification. The war ended not with a climactic battle but with complete capitulation. 3 months after the fall of Haven's Rest, Admiral Sarah Kensington stood before the Galactic Peace Coalition once more. The Great Chamber was filled with representatives who looked at her very differently than they had before. Some showed fear, others showed respect, and a few showed both. The human delegation had grown larger, now including military officers whose uniforms carried insignia that most species could not translate but somehow understood meant danger. The conflict with the Zithran Collective has ended, Sarah announced. Her voice was steady but she looked older, as if the past months had aged her decades. The Collective has accepted all terms of surrender. Zithran territory has been reduced to 3 worlds under permanent human monitoring. Their military has been dismantled. Genetic treatments are being administered to reverse the reproductive modifications. The Zithran species will survive, but they will do so under conditions that ensure they never again mistake peaceful species for prey. She paused, looking around the chamber at beings who had once been colleagues and allies. Humanity is formally rejoining the Galactic Peace Coalition's warfare conventions. We will once again follow the rules of civilized conflict when dealing with species who respect those rules. But let me be absolutely clear about what has changed. New displays appeared behind her, showing updated coalition protocols that had been rewritten to include specific provisions for species that violated fundamental principles of sentient rights. The provisions were harsh and non-negotiable. Any species that deliberately harvested civilian populations, that processed sentient beings as resources, that rejected the basic premise of individual value would face immediate response. Not from a coalition vote, not from diplomatic channels, from humanity directly. We are not asking permission to enforce these principles, Sarah said quietly. We are informing you that we will enforce them whether you approve or not. For 30 years, humanity advocated for peace because we remember what we are capable of when we choose violence. The Zithran made us demonstrate that capability. I hope desperately that no other species makes the same mistake. A representative from the Velith Empire, a militant species that had resisted many coalition reforms, stood to speak. Admiral Kensington, this seems to place humanity as judge and executioner for the entire galaxy. What gives you that authority? Sarah considered the question for a long moment. Nothing gives us that authority, Ambassador. We are taking it. Because for 30 years we begged this coalition to establish meaningful consequences for species that commit atrocities. We shared our own bloody history as a warning. We offered our expertise in building peaceful civilizations. And when the Zithran harvested an entire human colony, this coalition offered us condolences and proposals for formal complaints. Her voice hardened slightly. So humanity has decided that we will be the consequence that this galaxy has been lacking. Not because we want to rule, not because we enjoy violence, but because we are the species that has spent centuries learning how to inflict maximum damage with minimum remorse when we decide that something must be stopped. She gathered her materials and prepared to leave. The Zithran learned that humanity chooses to be civilized, but never forget that it is a choice. They tested our commitment to that choice by processing our children into biological resources. The galaxy has now seen what happens when we stop choosing kindness. I sincerely hope you all take notes, because this is a lesson better learned through observation than experience. Sarah walked out of the chamber, leaving behind a silence filled with the weight of new understanding. The galaxy had spent 3 decades believing that humans were gentle because they were incapable of anything else. Now they knew the truth. Humans were gentle because they remembered what they had been, what they could still be, and they woke up every morning choosing to be something better. But that choice could be revoked. And now every species in the galaxy knew exactly what revocation looked like. Years later, when new species made first contact with the galactic community, they were always given the same warning. The humans will be among the kindest species you meet. They will offer friendship, share technology, and advocate for peaceful coexistence. Accept their kindness gratefully. Respect their principles absolutely. Because the humans choose to be kind, and you never want to see what they choose to be when kindness fails. The lesson of Haven's Rest was written in Zithran blood and encoded in Zithran genes. It said that humanity had tried for 30 years to teach the galaxy mercy through patience and example. When that failed, they taught the same lesson through terror and devastation. Both lessons said the same thing: some lines cannot be crossed, some principles cannot be violated, and some species should never be tested to see how far they will go to protect what they value. The Zithran had tested humanity and found monsters wearing diplomats' clothes. The rest of the galaxy learned to be grateful that the monsters preferred to wear those clothes and to never, ever give them a reason to take them off again.